Okay, thank you. So I'm reading the question from Samuel Ngali. Okay, just switch into the Portuguese channel to let them know this is what I'm doing. Okay, switching back into English. So the question is, these religious people congregate in the governmental idea. However, the principles of their belief is antagonistic or antagonical. There are a few that preach that you don't need to get a vaccine or to get vaccinated because the blood of Christ is enough, and other people defend that the vaccine is the mark of the beast, so to speak. How does the professor interpret this, which for me seems very contradictory? Thank you. That is the question from Samuel Nagali.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's a really interesting one, and I think it also demonstrates the complexity of how people think. So my interlocutors, what they'll say is, I'm not vaccination. I'm just against this particular vaccine. Um, and the best I can interpret it from really more of an anthropological sense of things is through the cognitive dissonance lens. So, which basically says they've made certain proclamations about this thing, this vaccine, this way of um, kind of allowing the Lord to heal you, and to go back on that would kind of undermine their authority, and so they need to kind of redouble, and say things, and so even now, some that will kind of moderate a little bit, they'll say things like, well, it's your own choice, but I think, and kind of go along these ways. But I do think, one of the chief things is that it has just become a political talking point, and just like the mask have, but that's a visual talking point. So, remember, um, you could, when you could walk through the grocery store, and in America, I mean, we're very tightly connected with two parties. Third parties are out there, but they're very few and far between. And so you used to be able to walk through the grocery store and not know if you're passing a Republican or a Democrat, generally speaking. But then you add mask in there, and the Republican Party is coming so much against mask that to wear one becomes kind of an outwardly way to show what political party that you're showing allegiance to. So yeah, I mean, I think on theological grounds, I'm really mystified uh, by these statements, and I've got to do a lot more reading and kind of the intentional deceit, or um, because I think some of that is going on here too with for political gains, because I know some of these politicians are receiving, I mean, not politicians, some of these pastors are receiving the vaccine, but then coming out against it.
Yes.
And so that's a challenge too.
We have a
I
question.
think
We have a question from Felix. Felix, can you unmute from Malawi? Go ahead and ask your question.
Yes.
Um, I was really interested with your, your hanging out in Jim's terms with the evangelical group around President Trump. And I was wondering if you were to do like a study on the political culture of a group like that, what methods would you use? How do you go about it? Thanks.
Oh, no, that's a great question. I'm kind of learning the methods around Zoom because it's changed a bit. Because Zoom did a lot of the work that in the field I would have to do in other ways. So these meetings were recorded. So I have the meetings actually recorded, and then from the recording, I turned them all into uh, word by word transcripts. This is a little bit controversial for some anthropologists about whether I needed to do that or not, but I thought because of the implications here, I wanted to have every word, documented in case someone, had a question about something. Um, so yeah, in some ways, it was easier, and then in other ways, it was more difficult because this is a Zoom meeting, right? And it's hard to know, like, you know, physical cues of certain people on the call. Are they in agreement or with what something is saying? Are they not? So there are limits, but yeah, that's kind of how I'm doing this, and I'll really have to read uh, a little bit more about people who've done some digital ethnography and that type of thing to see how they kind of work in these spheres. But
But
it's
how about ordinarily, how would you have done it if it wasn't the Zoom experience, but you had access to them?
oh well, if the meetings were in place, then I would have attended the prayer meetings. I mean, before the meeting ever any meeting takes place, there are certain things that you need to do, like get agreement with the group, let them know that you're there. I'm never, I think, from an ethical standpoint, of I don't think anthropologists are spies or and I don't think it even necessarily um, limits your findings. You just need to, be honest about why you're there. I would have recorded the meeting on probably on my cell phone, and I would have been taking notes throughout. Paying attention to those cues, like someone's saying this, but then I'm looking over here and like this person seems to be in disagreement. Sometimes I'll follow up on those cues, like did I read this correctly, or were you just readjusting, or whatever. But I think at the very heart of it, and uh, Jim really talked about this. I mean, at the heart of it is immersion, um, and so that's kind of history with anthropology. I do think these, new digital worlds bring up some interesting opportunities, but some challenges. But that's how I would have gone to get it. Now, these groups tend to be pretty closed. Um,
Okay.
I had to be like, well, I was vetted. Like they were like, "What are you doing here?" and "What do you plan to do?" I mean, they're just. It was odd in that way. Something I'd never really, experienced before. Um, but yeah, and like said in my talk, I kind of lucked into this. Like I knew some people who were in it. They were like, "Hey, what about coming around?"
I'd like
a
to
follow-up
comment on
question.
that for a moment,
Yeah.
because traditionally, an anthropologist would do field work for a really long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
But usually anthropologists don't get to do field work up. They tend to do field work down to people of lower status. It's one of the reasons among sociologists, there are a couple of ethnographies of very rich people, but usually they don't let you in. And in colonial ethnography, the ethnographer had a certain amount of power of the colonizer behind them. So it was hard to exclude folks. But even there, people didn't have real access to the centers of power. And so that's one of the reasons that anthropologists, their topic was popular culture, because, you could hang out with the people. And even then, you would end up with one or two key informants who would talk to you about such things as, well, how do you deal with this issue of getting these prophecies and a sense of what you're being told? But, you and I both know that when God gives us a sense of something, it's not really, we don't get it in hard print. We don't tend to get the stone tablets. We get intimations and leadings. So how do you balance that against the fact that if you come out with prophecy X, your salary is going to disappear? I wouldn't be that blunt with them, but you can do that off stage with a key informant. Taking a look at Irving Goffman's presentation of self in everyday life is a lovely way of describing how anthropologists have to work the backstage and the front stage. And there's different things you can accomplish. And sometimes you just can't get that information.
Yeah, absolutely. And to add to the complexity of what you're, of what you're saying, is it's odd to be doing anthropology up with a group that's primarily made up of people who have not ever had this type of access before. So they were reaching up because President Trump reached, I guess you could say, down to them to bring them into this circle. Now, I'm not saying these folks have been politically disinterested before. It's not like that. And some of them had even been courted by presidents in the past in the election stage, but the access was unprecedented. One informant told me in the first year he was in the Oval Office 100 times. Nobody gets that kind of, I mean, the vice president doesn't get to the Oval Office 100 times. I mean, that's just, so it was just an unprecedented type of thing. So yeah, very much, adds to the complexity of this. And that's, one of the reasons I'm spending longer than I should to write things up, because I'm trying to figure out some of these things, because you're exactly right. What's normalized is kind of working at our level or being invited in another way. But yeah.
Felix, did you have something more you wanted to add?
Yeah. Because I was also thinking in terms of, say, a political culture, or the political culture of the elite, vis-a-vis a political theology that speaks to that. Obviously, to some extent, it would be great to have access to those people and to study them. And I'm also thinking in terms of, even those prophetic groups that many times tend to be closed in, and so if you are going to speak to them theologically and where they're at and what's going on in there, usually I think the tendency is that they would be, they would not give access to a lot of people. And so in those circumstances, how do you still, do work as an anthropologist?
This project in particular has blurred those lines in ways that have been challenging. So, I have as an anthropologist, we understand roles a lot, right? What role am I in this particular situation? So, while attending the prayer meetings, I never prayed. Um, I'm trying to think. In the very beginning, I may have said something just like hello or something, but after that, I was just a participant observer with less focus on the participation and more on the observation. But there were a couple times. One, as I've talked about several times, this misinformation about the COVID-19 virus from the earliest stages in February of 2020. I really jumped out of my anthropologist role to try to speak what I see, and I'll quantify that. I mean, what I see as truth about this. Now, my views were developed because I married to an award-winning biochemist who can explain in intricate details why the vaccines were safe, why, how the science developed. So I had a little bit of a way to speak. So I kind of broke, there. And then more recently, and I wouldn't even say this was kind of breaking my role as the anthropologist, I had a series of questions within my interlocutors about the election fraud in Georgia. And so I shared with him the information I had from people who had done numerous investigations into election fraud, Republicans who wanted President Trump to be elected, but could not find any. So there was no and so I shared that with my interlocutor, and that's when he's like, well, that's what they say. We're not going to know these truths until we get to heaven anyway. And I'm like, okay, well, I mean, in my mind, I'm thinking, well, if you're thinking that open-mindedly about it, why are you so persistent that there was fraud? Just leave it as, we can't know right now. But their positionality is there absolutely was fraud. I don't care what your, person who actually did the counting and saw the ballots for themselves said. So that's, yeah. So that's just from my own experience. Other anthropologists may jump all these roles, but before I've been much more able to maintain, a bit of that outsider's perspective on things.
Afa has
Thank
an
you.
announcement to make, and then I'd like to go on to Theodros if we can. Could we have another person with a question?
Okay, so thank you, Jim. This is breaking news. Just to announce that there's a successful coup against the directors, consultant, and program manager just now. No one hardly came to us, so sad. The coup was successful. Congrats to Derrick for becoming the new president. So what that means, there's no break-up session. So don't appear to go to that room, to go to the other room. The other room is locked for now. Stay here. Thank you.
Okay. Theodros.
Thank you for giving me this privilege to pose my question. I would like to thank Professor Lemons for this stimulating lecture. I'm coming from the Ethiopian background. I live and teach in Ethiopia, where there is an ongoing war between the Ethiopian state and the northern regional state of Tigray. And there there are so many prophecies that legitimize this war of annihilation. But my question is related to theoretical questions that came to my mind. The first is about the relationship between theology and social theory, given the fact that he had a reference to John Milbank, who has this provocative statement at the beginning of the book on social theology and social theory. Once there was no secular. So what is your take on that? What do you think the relationship between theology and other disciplines such as anthropology be? And the second question is regarding the commonality between theology and anthropology. As we know, anthropology is interested in thick descriptions, while theology has a focus on normativity. So what would be this relationship of commonality? Is it a sort of, do you see complementarity in that kind of relationship of commonality, or could there be any divergence at times? Not only reciprocity, but divergence between these disciplines.
Very good. So both your questions, I think, are somewhat related to each other. You know, I think John Milbank's work, what it did well, in many words, is kind of calls people to think about what are the commitments of social theory, you know. And so I think on some level, and I really call my students on this type of thing all the time, the idea of kind of open-mindedness, or, you know, whatever, is very problematic, because I'm most concerned about people who say, well, I'm completely open-minded, you know, about things. I'm less concerned with people who have worked, and I'm not saying we can do this, you know, 100%, but who have worked reflexively to begin kind of understanding, what am I bringing to this? Because what we're bringing influences what we hear, the questions that interest us. You know, so, I mean, how many social studies or social scientific studies have been done on phenomena that are not really central to the culture being studied, but it was just kind of a intellectual curiosity of the social scientist. So, you know, I think Milbank did a good job with that. He provoked a reaction within the anthropological world that really helped to stimulate a conversation around the anthropology of Christianity. And then even it helped further stimulate a conversation between anthropologists needing to engage with theologians. So are there underlying commitments of both? Yes. Normativity, and I think, you know, reflexively you could look at, I mean, anthropology has their sense of normativity too, right? You know, and that kind of informs the discipline. You know, theology does as well. I'm someone who is open to various types of relationships between anthropologists and theologians, as long as they kind of understand what those what the relationship is. I mean, so many of these collaborations will just be a collaboration of convenience. There's an anthropologist who needs help understanding something that is happening in a social context that a theologian can say, oh, well, that's what this is. I witnessed this happening with a senior anthropologist and a senior theologian. They were was at a meeting at Cambridge, and Joel Robbins, who did work in Papua New Guinea, had a question about his field work, and Sarah Coakley was in the room, and so Joel Robbins was saying, well, the Europmen were kind of one of these classic Melanesian societies that valued the notion of the gift, so they never eat anything that has grown by themselves. Instead, they always eat something that's grown by someone else. If you ate something that you grew, it was known as eating for nothing. And so they believe by giving the sweet potatoes to others, it counts as nourishing the body, but it also counts as nourishing social relations. So he's been trying to understand this notion of the gift. And what is this give and take? The Europmen, part of the kind of the famous story about them is when missionaries came, they had to become sinners so that they could become Christian, because they didn't really have a very solid notion of sin and their need of salvation. And so they first converted to being sinners, and then they converted to becoming Christian. Well, Sarah Coakley, who was in the room, she said, well, the obvious theological response is that the notion of gift has been raised to a higher transcendent level. So the divine gift of Christ is shared with husbands and wives and everyone. And then she recommended a book by John Barclay about Paul and the gift. And, Joel was like, wow, this really could help me understand gift on another level, because I know the book of Romans is really important to the Europmen. So what's that relationship? I mean, it's a relationship of convenience. Yeah, that's interesting information.
Derrick, we've got 15 minutes, and we have two more in line here that I'd like to.
Sure.
Kiama, can you give us your question?
Yes, please. And thank you again. This is Kiama from Kenya. And I wanted to just throw this out there. I'm grappling with something that several people have said, that as an ethnographer or in an ethnographic study, I bring something to the table. I come with my own, from a particular worldview. For example, an integrated worldview that does not divide secular and sacred. And again, as an ethnographer, coming from that background, or that as a dominant perspective, I come and do an ethnographic study on people who have, again, an integrated worldview. The question that I'd like to ask, or what I'm grappling with, and would love to hear, some of your thoughts around this, is when it comes to presenting the data, analyzing the data, and then presenting it, the conventions around which anthropological studies have been presented, and even the theology that many of us have come out of comes from a different worldview. And it seems to me that there may be a need to consider other kinds of categories or other ways of presenting and analyzing the data that somehow illuminate some of the nuances in this. And some of those might have to be created from within the context that we come from. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts around that.
Oh, such a great question. So what I'll just share how I have chosen to do these things. Is for me, I try to understand the audience that I'm as best I can to dictate kind of how I present things. So let me give you just a quick example. When I first started out presenting, 12 years ago, so I was a pastor. Well, I still am a pastor, but I was a full-time pastor before I got into academia. Now I do the professor thing and I'm a pastor. But like the worst thing I could have done in my context is to just read a manuscript. That's not the type of church that I came from. Like that was, the frozen chosen down the road, the Presbyterians who were more educated than us. I come from kind of a blue collar church background. Well, so when I started presenting in academic settings, I kind of brought that preaching thing to academia. Now, in my opinion, I thought what I was doing was much more interesting because these people reading the papers, I thought, oh my goodness, this is horrendous. I'm bored to death. I can't even imagine. I'm thinking all of these thoughts and everything. When I was presenting in that more preachy type of way, and I'm not meaning preaching like, just entertaining. Maybe I'll use that instead of preachy. I noticed like nobody had questions for things that I said, and then like the next person would deliver this giant academic paper that they just read there, and I barely could stay awake for, and then they had gobs of questions for that. I was like, what is going on here? And so eventually I was like, well, I guess I'll just write this thing out and see what happens. Sure enough, I started getting lots of questions about what I was writing. And so that was me kind of adapting to the audience that I was with. Now, in my wife's world, she's in a scientific world. She's like, why are y'all still reading papers all the time? They show slides and they do all this other type of thing. The separation of the worlds. I think the perspective you're coming from is probably a much more honest way. I'm not sure how easily we do divide the secular and the sacred in our lived experiences and everything. But my advice for someone is try to understand, what the audience is here, and this is this audience here. I've been trying to figure out, and I'm not sure if I hit the mark because y'all are academics and many of you are kind of not separating these things. So I've really enjoyed the presentations here a lot. But I think that's a really good question that you ask. But I have noticed that some people will come in and some of the settings and give kind of more of a I was doing, a preachy thing, and then people just kind of dismiss it. So I think it kind of depends if you want to be heard, if that makes sense.
Henrietta has a question.
Okay.
Henrietta?
Yes, I'm there.
Good.
Yes, thanks so much, Derrick, for your really interesting presentation. The examples you gave about on the evangelicals, one thing that pops up is this notion of truth, reality, and contested truth. And whose realities are these? And in terms of anthropological and theological and perhaps hermeneutics, how would you analyze these messages and these truths? Because it's for some people, these are facts, these are truth. For others, it's very much contested. So in your analysis, following your conviviality of interdisciplinarity, how would you analyze these notions of truth and contestation?
Oh, wow. Such a great question. And I think that's part of my struggle personally with this because, you're exactly right. I mean, whose truth? Well, when I get to writing, I'll have to decide these types of things. And there are different ways to, to do this. But, like I said, I mean, I can appeal to the truth of what is physically verifiable with voter fraud. I mean, like there are printed ballots. Like we know the process in Georgia to do your vote. We do use machines, but that machine is just used to print out a ballot that you get to look at and say, oh yeah, I voted for those people. And they ask you, did you vote for these people? And they say, yeah, and then you hand it in. So to me, that's like physically, and all of those things have been recounted by hand. I mean, I think they've gone through 4 recounts and it all. So in my mind, the truth is what can be seen. But my interlocutors, the truth is what the Lord revealed to them, and that is that President Trump was reelected. Therefore, this thing that you can see, like I could put 1,000,000 ballots out in front of you, you could count them yourself and come up with the same numbers. That's not truth. And I think when it comes to the writing stage is where I'm going to have to decide which way I'm going to go with this. In the past, my default has been to thickly describe the truth of the interlocutors. And, so, I mean, if they said, that they had this particular experience, there was nothing I would question about that. I would see it as my role as to best describe that in a way that they would understand it. So I've even had interlocutors look over, my interpretation before, so that they can say, "Oh yeah, that's what I'm saying." So I hope that helps. I think there are different ways that you can go about it, but it's all articulated out in the beginning of the writing piece. And so if I choose to say, well, let's look at these 2 truths, then I think part of the analysis is, well, then how did I get about what I sense as truth? What did they get about as their sense of truth? And kind of move in those directions.
Let me make a suggestion, Derrick.
Yeah, please do.
One of the things you have in front of you is you have a set of texts. You have these things, these videos, these things that you've witnessed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You could do a discourse analysis of those texts, which would give you 2 things. First, it would give you a sense of what was being said and what the structures what the repeating structures of the messages and the kinds of things to which people refer. And you see how the rhetoric is put together.
Mm-hmm.
But you also then see what they leave out. What are both the topics and the kinds of argument that simply don't appear there that would appear in other settings.
Mm.
And so you're not trying to look into their minds because you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to give you access to that.
Mm-hmm.
But you can look into they are constructing a discursive universe in those particular meetings. And so in those meetings, and they're all trying to do the thing that's going to keep them there. Imagine the things that one of them might say that would get one of them thrown out.
Yeah.
What would get you thrown out.
And that was a central piece to this whole thing, because President Trump is famous for dismissing people.
Yeah.
And, I've known one of these interlocutors for 20 years, and I've never seen him hedging his opinions. But all of his opinions that he allowed to get out in the public fell directly in line with whatever the talking points President Trump would give them.
Right.
Because he had seen people who President Trump just went, a bridge too far. I mean, he just and questioned President Trump, like, really, this is not right. And next thing you know, they're not at the next meeting in the Oval Office. They're gone. They're fired. So some presidents, I think a lot of presidents kind of like, yes, people around them, but some value the alternative voice in the room just to give them a little perspective. But that is not at all, how President Trump did. So you're exactly right. What's in, what's out. Yeah.
Take a look at the documents from the Stalinist purges in the late 30s. As a point of comparison. As in, what things did people say in their admissions of guilt?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You're getting a party line. And that may be what you have to write about, is what is the religious leader's party line that allows them to stay in those particular settings?
Yeah, but then yes, absolutely, and I agree, and I think that's what's happening. But kind of the world that I thought I understood these people from is, they very much will speak out and against and malign people. They are prophetic in that sense too. But who is it that they allow themselves to prophesy against, and who not? That's the challenge, And before they were actually in the room, it was a little more equal. But then you kind of say, "Whoa, this thing has changed." So that 20-year relationship has allowed me to see someone who, when they were in the room, understood they needed to change to stay in the room. And I think that some evangelicals have really, who were part of the moral majority, kind of famously in the mid-90s said, we've been courting political power so much that we've actually lost our voice. Our voice is in the pulpits, not in the White House, So anyway, thank you for those insights.
Are there any other questions that people have, or pieces of advice, or words of wisdom that will help Derrick on this problem? Derrick, I really appreciate you, asking for advice from the whole assembled folks, because everyone here has wisdom.
Absolutely.
Jim, I think we are out of time. Sorry.
Yep, that's fine.
Okay.
Back to Afa.
No, I think this has been very fascinating. of course, I mean, the example Derrick brought is contemporary socio-political discourse. So in itself, I think we can resonate with this in our own different contexts, because it's not just about Trump, it's also about the conspiracy theories that generated, which has a backlash in our respective context. Also in Africa, I mean, there were a lot of political entrepreneurs and religious entrepreneurs who supported Trump and also helped in perpetuating these lies and conspiracy theories. So this, for me, is interesting. I think just to end this, there's a methodological question about what we researchers, depending on your cognitive location, how do we deal with truth claims and lies and stuff like that. From my own social cognitive location, I think descriptive methodology may not need to necessarily endorse truth claims. Rather, descriptively, one way of getting around that is to say, well, they claim that this is the truth. So you don't necessarily say whether that truth is a lie or a real truth, And so your presentation and analysis really makes clear that you are not endorsing, you are actually not making any kind of value judgment here. And I just wanted to illustrate this with my encounter sitting with a theologian and a philosopher having a debate. And at the end of the day, the theologian was very persuasive, saying, no, what I'm telling you, look at the scriptures. Our very Lord himself, Jesus Christ, said it, and referred to the verse. The philosopher said, well, I don't dispute that Jesus Christ himself said it, but from a philosophical point of view, it's a different question whether what he said is true or not. That is a philosophical question. So you see how the kind of a conversation between the theologian and the philosopher hit a kind of a rock here. One is affirming, endorsing this truth claim that Jesus said it. The philosopher coming with his own cap saying, yes, I don't dispute that, but I'm raising the question whether what he said, is true or false. That is a philosophical question. So this is, I find very interesting. And in actual fact, it segues into our next session after the break, where we want to encourage the project leaders to kind of reflect on what they have been seeing and hearing, and how